There is a new weapon operating over occupied Ukrainian territory, and Russia has no answer for it. It does not have a NATO designation yet. Most analysts had never heard of it until recently. But the footage coming out of the occupied south tells the story clearly. A drone named after a Celtic goddess of war is turning Russia's most critical supply corridor into a killing field, and the implications for Crimea are enormous. The weapon is called Morrigan. In Celtic mythology, the Morrigan is the goddess of war, fate, and transformation, the figure who determines the outcome of battles and brings about irrevocable change. Ukraine chose that name deliberately. After more than a decade of Russian occupation, after years of being told that Crimea was gone forever, Ukraine is engineering the conditions under which that peninsula's fate can be changed. The Morrigan drone is one of the tools making that change possible. We learned about this weapon because a Ukrainian brigade decided the time was right to show the world what it had been doing. The 412th Nemesis Brigade published footage on social media showing the Morrigan drone in action along the R-280 Novorossiya Highway, the land corridor that connects Russia through Mariupol and Melitopol into Crimea. That footage shows drone after drone zeroing in on Russian military trucks, fuel carriers, and supply vehicles. The strikes are precise. The results are visible. Vehicles are burning. And the road that Russia has depended on to keep its occupied territories supplied is being systematically dismantled. The Nemesis Brigade did not just discover this drone. They helped build it. According to independent reporting, the Morrigan was co-developed between the brigade and Ukraine's defense establishment, specifically to address the challenge of attacking Russian logistics deep behind the front lines. This is not a weapon developed for general use and then adapted to a specific mission. It was designed from the ground up for the mission of isolating Crimea. The brigade built a weapon to achieve a strategic objective, and then they used it to achieve that objective. The results speak for themselves. What do we actually know about the Morrigan's technical characteristics? Not much, which is by design. Ukraine's military has been deliberate about not revealing the specifications of weapons that are still actively being used operationally. The brigade itself noted that it would not share details beyond what was necessary, because the effectiveness of the weapon depends on Russia not being able to fully understand and counter it. But the footage and independent analysis provide some baseline information worth understanding. The drone appears to be somewhere between 4 and 5 feet in length. It has swept wings and a pair of tail fins. Critically, it does not require a runway or prepared landing strip to launch. The footage shows it being deployed from what appears to be a rail or slingshot launch system. That is a major operational advantage. It means Ukrainian operators can set up virtually anywhere, without needing access to airfields or long stretches of flat ground that would make the launch position visible and vulnerable to Russian counterstrikes. The drone carries an FPV component. The footage shared by the brigade was captured by the drone itself as it approached targets, confirming that there are human operators involved in the guidance process. Whether the system incorporates any degree of automated targeting beyond that has not been confirmed. The warhead is clearly larger than what a standard FPV drone carries. Typical frontline FPV drones carry roughly 3 kilograms of explosive material. The scale of the explosions visible in the Morrigan footage suggests a considerably heavier payload. How much heavier has not been specified, but the ability to reliably destroy heavy military trucks and fuel vehicles with a single strike indicates a warhead in a different class than the typical close combat FPV drone. Range is perhaps the most important characteristic, and here the geography tells us what the brigade will not. The R-280 highway runs between 80 and 120 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian-controlled territory, depending on the specific stretch being targeted. The Morrigan is hitting that highway consistently. That establishes a minimum operational range of at least 120 kilometers, and likely more given the depth of some of the strikes being reported. This puts the drone firmly in the mid-range category, capable of operating well behind Russian lines without the need for the carrier aircraft systems that some other long-range drones depend on. Now let's talk about what this actually means for Crimea, because the strategic picture here is more significant than any individual drone strike or vehicle destroyed. Russia has occupied the Crimean Peninsula since 2014. For most of that period, maintaining control was relatively straightforward. Russia had sea access, a functioning bridge across the Kerch Strait, and overland supply routes through the territories it occupied in eastern and southern Ukraine. The land corridor, the R280, and the roads feeding into it became the primary logistical lifeline after Ukrainian strikes damaged the Kerch Bridge in 2022 and 2023, reducing its capacity and reliability for heavy military cargo. If Ukraine could disrupt that land corridor consistently, the calculus for holding Crimea would shift dramatically. That is exactly what is now happening. The Nemesis Brigade reported that in the weeks following the Morrigan's operational deployment, it had already destroyed dozens of Russian military trucks and fuel stations along the R280. Independent analysis of satellite imagery and geolocated strike data confirmed more than 125 separate truck destructions along the Crimean land bridge, with the majority of those taking place in May. The Center for European Policy Analysis assessed the implications and concluded that almost all of Russia's logistical support for its forces in Crimea and the Southern Front travels by road, and that sustained disruption of those road corridors would produce unavoidable and serious consequences for Russian operational capacity. The consequences are already materializing. Fuel rationing has been implemented in Sevastopol, Crimea's largest city. Residents are restricted to purchasing 20 liters of fuel per transaction, roughly 5 gallons. That rationing is a direct result of fuel tankers being destroyed on the R280 before they can complete their journey to the peninsula. The fuel supply chain is being interrupted at the source, and civilians are feeling the effects alongside military forces. Russia's response to the disruption of the R280 has been a combination of desperation and improvisation, neither of which is working particularly well. Russian military commanders established a minimum convoy speed of 120 kilometers per hour on the highway. That is not a speed limit, it is a floor. The theory appears to be that faster movement reduces the window during which drones can track and engage vehicles. Russian convoys are also now traveling at night to reduce visibility. Electronic warfare systems have been deployed along portions of the route in an attempt to disrupt drone guidance signals. None of these measures have stopped the strikes. Ukraine has continued hitting the R280 consistently despite the countermeasures, and the minimum speed requirement, essentially ordering military drivers to maintain dangerously high speeds on a highway at night, in convoys, under drone threat, creates its own risks. The combination of accidents and strikes has turned the route into something that Russian logistics commanders clearly do not want to use, but have no alternative to. Or rather, they had one alternative: the Kerch Bridge. After Ukrainian strikes in 2022, 2023, and again in mid-2025 damaged the bridge's structure and destroyed key support elements, Russia stopped using it for military cargo transport. The risk was assessed as too high. But with the R280 increasingly unusable, Russian-backed officials in the occupied territories have reportedly begun looking at whether the Kerch Bridge can be pressed back into service for supply movements. A spokesman for Ukraine's Navy addressed this prospect directly, suggesting that if Russia was forced to start routing fuel and military supplies across the bridge again, that would be a clear sign of strategic desperation, and would make the bridge a priority target again. The bridge, which cost Russia nearly $5 billion to construct, has already been struck multiple times. A return to using it for military purposes would put it back in Ukraine's crosshairs. This is the genius of what Ukraine has created in the R280 campaign. Russia is not choosing between a good option and a bad option. It is choosing between losing its land corridor and losing its bridge. Both routes are under threat. The alternatives that do not involve the R280 or the Kerch Bridge are longer, slower, and no less exposed to Ukrainian drone strikes. The Morrigan and the broader mid-range drone fleet have created a situation where there is no safe route into Crimea, and no combination of countermeasures Russia can deploy that fully neutralizes the threat. The broader context that the Morrigan operates within is the logistics lockdown program that Ukraine's defense ministry launched in late May. This initiative channels direct funding, close to $113 million in its first phase, to the brigades and units that are destroying Russian logistical assets behind the front lines. The Nemesis Brigade is one of those units. The Morrigan is one of those assets. The R280 campaign is one of the focal points of that program. What was already happening organically, Ukrainian drone operators targeting Russian logistics, has now been formalized, funded, and scaled. The record vehicle destruction numbers in May were not a coincidence. They were the direct result of a deliberately designed and funded campaign, and that campaign is continuing. The broader strategic picture that the Morrigan fits into involves not just logistics, but air defenses. Ukraine's mid-range drone fleet has been systematically targeting Russian air defense systems in the occupied territories throughout the spring. In February and March, roughly 300 Russian air defense units per month were being destroyed. April saw another 250 eliminated. Each air defense system Ukraine destroys either gets replaced, which depletes Russian air defense capacity elsewhere, or it does not get replaced, creating an aerial corridor where Ukrainian drones can operate with reduced risk. The destruction of air defenses over the occupied south has progressively opened the airspace that the Morrigan now operates in. The air defense campaign and the logistics campaign are interconnected parts of the same strategy. The Institute for the Study of War assessed in late May that Ukraine's mid-range strike campaign was now sufficiently degrading Russian logistical capacity that Russia's ability to move personnel to the front, resupply frontline positions, and concentrate force for offensive operations was being meaningfully impaired. Russia's net territorial gains in May were assessed as approaching zero in several sectors, partly as a direct consequence of logistical disruption. Ukraine has also been able to execute limited but successful counterattacks, including recapturing approximately 400 square kilometers of territory in the Dnipropetrovsk region in May, enabled in part by the weakening of Russian rear area capacity. Open-source analysis of confirmed Ukrainian deep strikes shows that more than 1,000 geolocated attacks in the Russian rear have been documented, with the actual total almost certainly higher. Roughly 35% of those strikes targeted fuel, equipment, and ammunition storage. 20% targeted transport vehicles. 7% targeted air defense systems. The pattern is deliberate. Degrade the fuel supply, destroy the transport, eliminate the air defenses, and the frontline force that all of those systems support becomes progressively less capable. For Crimea specifically, the trajectory of this campaign points toward a phase that military analysts had previously described as unlikely in the near term: genuine isolation of the peninsula. A retired senior American military commander who served as commanding general of United States Army Europe described the pathway to Crimea's liberation in terms that align precisely with what Ukraine is now executing. The first phase, in his assessment, is isolation, cutting off the roads and destroying the bridge. The second phase is rendering the peninsula unusable as a military base. Ukraine does not need to send ground forces into Crimea to achieve either of those objectives. It needs to sustain the drone campaign, tighten the logistical stranglehold, and force Russia into a position where the cost of holding the peninsula exceeds the strategic value it provides. That process is underway. The Azov Brigade of Ukraine's National Guard reported in early June that Ukrainian forces had effectively established air dominance over Mariupol, a city Russia has occupied since early in the full-scale invasion. They achieved this not through manned aircraft, but through sustained drone operations that degraded Russian air defenses over the city and its surroundings. With that air dominance established, the R-280 south of Mariupol became accessible to Ukrainian drone operators in ways it had not been before. The 17 confirmed strikes against Russian fuel and military vehicles on the stretch of highway between Melitopol and Crimea in May alone reflect that expanded access. The Morrigan is not the only weapon in this campaign, and it will not be the last new system Ukraine introduces. The broader procurement and development program that produced the Morrigan is continuing, with Ukraine's defense establishment working to acquire additional mid-range strike systems through centralized tender processes. The goal is to ensure that the tempo of strikes against Russian logistics can be maintained and increased, even as Russia adapts its countermeasures. The record numbers from May are intended to be a floor, not a ceiling. What Ukraine has built in Crimea's case is a layered, mutually reinforcing strategic campaign. Destroy the air defenses to open the airspace. Use the open airspace to destroy the logistics. Destroying the logistics creates fuel shortages and supply failures. Supply failures force Russia onto alternative routes. Alternative routes are also within drone range. The Kerch Bridge becomes a target again the moment Russia is desperate enough to use it. Every step Russia takes to adapt generates a new vulnerability that Ukraine can exploit. The Morrigan is the goddess of fate in this story because the outcome is beginning to look inevitable. Not through any single dramatic event, but through the patient, systematic application of a strategy that leaves Russia with no good choices. Stay with us as this campaign continues to develop. The situation in Crimea and across the occupied South is changing faster than most people realize, and we will be here to cover every development in detail. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Let's examine the operational significance of the Morrigan from a different angle, what it represents in the evolution of Ukraine's drone warfare doctrine. When the full-scale invasion began in February 2022, Ukraine's drone capabilities were impressive for a non-NATO state, but still limited in terms of range, payload, and operational scale. The small commercial drones adapted for military use that characterized early Ukrainian drone operations gave way to a more sophisticated and diversified fleet over the following 2 years. But the real acceleration came in 2025 and 2026, when Ukraine began deploying weapons like the Morrigan that combined the tactical precision of FPV drones with operational ranges previously associated with much larger and more expensive strike systems. The significance of this development is not just about range numbers. It is about what those range numbers mean for the way wars are fought. Traditional military thinking divided the battlefield into the close combat zone, the deep battle zone, and the strategic rear. Weapons capable of reaching the deep battle zone, artillery, rockets, tactical missiles, were expensive, required significant logistics themselves, and were available in limited quantities. Ukraine could not match Russia in those categories. What Ukraine did instead was develop a new category of weapon that could reach deep battle distances at a fraction of the cost, and in quantities that Russia's electronic warfare and air defense systems struggled to handle at scale. The Morrigan is a product of that development philosophy. When you can deploy hundreds of mid-range drones for the cost of a small number of conventional deep strike weapons, the economics of the battlefield change. Russia cannot cost-effectively intercept every drone. It cannot maintain air defense coverage across the entire operational depth. It cannot protect every vehicle on every road. Ukraine has essentially weaponized volume and cost asymmetry. Cheap enough to produce in large numbers, accurate enough to hit specific targets, ranged enough to reach the depth where logistics actually operate. This combination is what the Morrigan represents, and it is why it has been so effective against the R280. The decision by the Nemesis Brigade to publicly reveal the Morrigan's existence at this stage is itself strategically interesting. Ukraine's drone development program has produced numerous systems that the public never hears about until they are already so deeply integrated into operational use that revealing them provides minimal advantage to Russia. The disclosure of the Morrigan, with carefully limited technical details, serves a different purpose. It communicates capability. It signals to Russia that a new class of weapon is now operating in the deep operational space around Crimea. It tells Russian logistics commanders that the R280 is not going to become safer over time. It is going to become more dangerous. And it communicates to Ukraine's international supporters and the broader public that the campaign to isolate Crimea is not just an aspiration. It is an active, funded, operationally successful program with dedicated weapons systems built specifically for the mission. There is also a morale and recruitment dimension to the public disclosure. Ukraine's defense establishment has been transparent about using public disclosure of military successes to sustain domestic and international support for the war effort. Showing the Morrigan in action, showing Russian trucks burning on the highway that connects Russia to Crimea, showing the systematic dismantling of a supply corridor that Russia depends on, all of that reinforces the narrative that Ukraine is winning where it matters, degrading Russia's ability to sustain its occupation, and moving toward objectives that once seemed out of reach. That narrative matters in a long war where sustaining will and resources requires continuous evidence of progress. Looking at the broader context of what Crimea represents for both sides makes the importance of this campaign clearer. For Russia, Crimea is not just territory. It is the symbolic crown jewel of Putin's project of rebuilding Russian influence over what he considers historically Russian lands. It is the home of the Black Sea Fleet. It is a military staging area for operations across southern Ukraine. It is a source of domestic political legitimacy. Losing Crimea, or being forced into a position where holding Crimea becomes strategically untenable, would represent a defeat of an entirely different order of magnitude than losing ground on the front lines in Donetsk or Zaporizhia. For Ukraine, Crimea's liberation has always been the ultimate objective, the proof that Russian aggression can be fully reversed, that territorial concessions made under duress do not become permanent, and that the sovereignty of a democratic country cannot be permanently violated by a larger neighbor through force. The path to that objective has seemed impossibly long for most of the past decade. The Morrigan, the logistics lockdown program, the systematic destruction of Russian air defenses and supply lines. These are not simply tactical gains. They are the building blocks of a strategic transformation that is making the once impossible look increasingly plausible. The Morrigan flies. The R-280 burns. And the fate of Crimea is being decided not in a single dramatic battle, but in the cumulative weight of 1,000 drone strikes that Russia cannot stop and cannot absorb indefinitely. Stay with us. Subscribe so you are here for every development in this story as it continues to unfold.